Welcome to the Waterloo podcast. My name is Martin Aaron. Since the year 2000, I've been building a database of the British Army at Waterloo. By compiling original records from the Public Record Office and Regimental Archives, I've gathered information about each of the 33,000 British combatants in 1815. This podcast series examines that data. Welcome to episode 32 and the next in our series of studies of the Royal Artillery in the Waterloo campaign. This week we'll be talking about one of the 3rd Battalion batteries, this one commanded by Brevet Major Thomas Rogers. He was from Norwich and aged 38 at Waterloo. In 1815 the battery, or company to give it its more correct name, comprised 5 9-pounder guns and 1 howitzer, manned by 103 officers and other ranks. As always, we'll start by finding out about the men of the battery and then move on to hear about their experiences in 1815. Let's begin, as always, finding out who these men were. There's birthplace data recorded for 80 of the 98 other ranks. I think some more digging at the Public Record Office should fill in the gaps eventually, but for now we have 47 English, 25 Scots and 8 Irish. In terms of counties, well, with such a small number of men it's perhaps only of passing interest, but Lancashire is again the most common county of origin, with 14 gunners and Corporal James Lucas from there. For age, there are 68 men with birth date data. The median birth year is 1786, so 29 years old at Waterloo. The oldest men in the company were Sergeant William Bannister from Birmingham and Gunner George Hallam from Mansfield, Nottinghamshire, both born in 1773 and thus aged 42 in 1815. The youngest was drummer James Galloway, born in Canterbury, who'd enlisted as a drummer boy aged just 9 in 1808 and was thus still only 16 in 1815. The other ranks of Rogers' battery must have been very familiar with each other, there being no new recruits since 1812. The most recently enlisted man was Gunner James Lorry from Ford in Northumberland, who'd enlisted in December that year. There's enlistment data for 100% of the men, and this shows a median date of 1806, so 9 years service before Waterloo. The longest serving man was Sergeant Gerard Brandon from Enniskillen, Fermanagh, who'd been in the artillery since 1794. But while the other ranks were settled and had been together for a long time, and under the command of Thomas Rogers since 1806, 3 of the officers had joined more recently. Second Lieutenant Wilson was just 20 years old and had only been commissioned in December 1813. While Second Lieutenants Maule and Dunnicliffe had been drafted in as replacements only weeks before the battle. The reason for this would have been because Lieutenant George Coles was absent, serving as Staff Adjutant to Sir George Wood, Commander of the Royal Artillery. George Maule was originally from the 5th Battalion, who were not present at Waterloo, and must have been transferred in on detachment to cover Coles. Lieutenant Maule never appears on the battery's musters, so he must have been and gone, seeing action over the 3 days, Quatre, the retreat through Genappe, then Waterloo, before returning to his battalion. Lieutenant Henry Dunnicliffe was on the muster, along with a note stating he had been transferred from the 7th Battalion, also not at Waterloo, on the 1st of June. But this handwritten note on the June muster next to his name says not yet joined, and it makes me wonder whether he was actually present. A possible theory is that with Coles absent on the staff, Dunnicliffe was drafted in as a replacement, but not arriving from England in time, Maule, who was in Flanders with Captain Ilbert's detachment, stepped in as a last-minute temporary replacement. This theory is supported by Lieutenant Maule's own journal, which on the 15th of June mentions myself and 3 officers. So that's 3 and not 4 if Dunnicliffe had been there. I'm not sure. Dunnicliffe left the army in 1819 on half pay and is listed as a Waterloo officer on subsequent army lists. But that little scribbled note on the muster does make me wonder if Rogers' battery perhaps had only 4 officers in the field at Waterloo. If anyone has any information, please do get in touch. For actual combat experience, Rogers' men had not served in the peninsula, but had been to the Netherlands, to Walcheren in 1809, around 80% of the Waterloo men taking part in that disastrous expedition, with the company then returning to the lowlands with Sir Thomas Graham's operations in 1813-1814. So let's look in more detail at the battery, and we can see the officers here, probably Scott, Maul and Wilson, commanding 2 guns each, assisted by 3 sergeants, again overseeing 2 guns each. Then 1 corporal, 8 bombardiers, 86 gunners, 30 of whom would have actually fired the guns, the rest carrying ammunition back and forth and helping drag the guns back into position. And let's not forget the drummer, young James Galloway. Let's move now to Flanders, where Rogers' company was one of only 2 British artillery units to reach the Battle of Quatre on the 16th of June, in time to take part in the action. The other was Lloyd's company, and you can listen to their experience in episode 10. Rogers' company marched from Brussels early in the morning of the 16th of June. They passed through the Namur Gate, following the 1st Battalion of the 95th Foot, whose band were playing the British Grenadiers, arriving at the battlefield sometime after 1 p.m. The company was positioned at the junction of the Namur Road and the Chemy-Bâti Saint-Bernard. If we look at a modern Google Street View, we can see the position here on our left. This is looking up the Namur Road towards Quatre, and as we come round we can look south to where the French forces would have been. Major Rogers, on being asked 20 years later what he recalled of the 16th of June, he wrote,
"About the time the division took its position at Quatre, or very soon after, we were engaged with some French artillery, which opened a heavy fire upon us. In addition to that, the musketry, killing and wounding several of our men and horses. The number of guns we could not judge of with any degree of precision. They were partly concealed by the wood, and we think they were stationary during the action, as we did not observe them advancing or retiring."
Rogers describes these French guns being positioned either within or just outside a small wood, with a large pond on their left, which would presumably place them here, this being the Etang Materne, the only body of water in the vicinity. These pictures are from Jack Weller's book Wellington at Waterloo and were taken in the late 1960s. The wood on the other side of the Namur Road is no longer there. Rogers' battery would have been out of shot to the left, just a little way further along the Namur Road here. Here's another one, with Quatre in the foreground on the left, looking southeastward. Here's the Etang Marne again in the distance, and Rogers' company would have been somewhere around here. His guns picked out French infantry manoeuvring past the lake, into which they poured their fire.
Our attention was much engaged in firing spherical case shots at a column which, passing the piece of water I've mentioned, attempted to turn our left flank. We were at one time menaced by a body of heavy cavalry, but not charged by them.
Lieutenant George Maul, writing in his journal, describes the confusion and uncertainty of a battle in which both sides were arriving piecemeal, so that neither side was ever sure of the size of the enemy they faced.
This fighting continued some time, each party apparently totally ignorant of the force of the other. Fresh troops too, arriving on both sides, continued the fighting until dark.
On the 17th of June, Rogers' company joined the rest of the Allied army in its retreat northwards, trudging through torrential rain. And as we heard in the episode about Lloyd's troop, even on arrival at the Waterloo position, the exhausted men were still required to engage with their French counterparts, firing up the road towards La Belle Alliance until the guns were firing into the darkness.
The French, who had the whole day kept close up to our rear, formed on and under the hills directly in front of us at about 3/4 of a mile, and a slight cannonading took place which lasted until dark, nay, even until after dark. The French are always almost determined to fire the last shot, and if I remember right, though we fired very slow till very late, they managed to succeed in their wish.
following morning, as the Battle of Waterloo began, Sir William Gom describes Rogers' guns firing first in reply to the massed cannonade of the French guns, and then into the massed ranks of d'Erlon's infantry as they began their large march up the slope towards the Allied position. Behind Rogers' guns were Kemp's brigade. In front of the hedge lining the Ohain road, which roughly marked the Allied line on this side of the battlefield, were positioned Bylont's Dutch infantry, spread out in line. Gom describes Rogers' guns firing over the heads of these Netherlanders as the French infantry approached. However, while Gom describes Rogers returning the initial fire of the French Grand Battery, Rogers recalls being ordered not to do so. He describes coming under fire from the French guns,
by which we lost some horses, but restrained by Sir Thomas Picton from returning it.
Rogers' account does, though, agree with Gom's in that they kept up a constant fire into d'Erlon's columns until these French infantry arrived at the hedge at the top of the slope. Here, they were met first by the Allied infantry line. At this moment of crisis, it must have seemed that the whole battery was in danger of being overwhelmed by the mass of advancing Frenchmen, and one of the battery's sergeants acted quickly and decisively. He spiked one of his guns, hammering home a metal spike into the vent hole, thus rendering the gun inoperable. It would prevent the very worst case scenario, that is, the shame of British guns not only being captured, but also then turned on their own men. This one action gives such clear insight into how invincible d'Erlon's attack must have seemed in those moments of crisis. Surely nothing could stop such a vast mass of men, trudging relentlessly onwards, seemingly oblivious to the devastating Allied fire, which cut down whole ranks in swathes. However, at this point, as we've heard in the last 3 episodes, there arrived the 3 cavalry regiments of the Union Brigade, who crossed the hedge and crashed down into the helpless French infantry, sweeping them away. At this point, being in the thick of the chaos, Rogers could not say with any certainty what happened.
The smoke became so dense and the melee so complete that it is impossible at this distant period of time to describe with sufficient accuracy the movement of any particular body of the parties engaged.
But one event was shocking enough to still be recalled years later.
About this moment, Sir Thomas Picton was killed, close to one of the guns of the battery.
With the threat of this first French attack over, Rogers' battery was moved down the road to a new position to the right and rear of La Haye Sainte. It was now down to 5 guns, the spiked gun being removed to the rear. Wynyate's rocket troop came up and took position on the grounds that Rogers' guns had just vacated. In their new position, Rogers' battery was engaged for most of the afternoon. Later, the battery was moved further right again, and from this position, towards the end of the day, fired into the columns of Imperial Guard comprising the final French attack. Rogers describes having the 52nd foot on his right during this critical moment.
Our fire taking the advancing French columns diagonally on their left front.
According to Captain Maul, the battery had only 3 guns left for this final position, 2 more being disabled by the loss of horses. With this final French advance defeated and falling back, still Rogers' battery was keen to continue.
In the final advance of the English force and the retreat of the French, the battery limbered up and joined in the pursuit. Owing to the depth to which the wheels sank in the heavy field we traversed, and some horses being more exhausted than others, the rear guns could not keep up with those leading the column. I therefore directed my second captain to bring up the rear of the battery with the ammunition carriages, and advanced with Captain Maul and the leading guns, diagonally across the field, partly crossed the small cross road, until we came to the Ginat road, which we ascended until a little way beyond the house of La Belle-Alliance, where we fell in with the Prussian troops, close to the left of the main road, and, the pursuit being continued by the Prussians, bivouacked there for the night.
According to Lieutenant Maul, this diagonal advance across the battlefield involved yet further fighting.
I accompanied with 2 guns the cavalry along a country road, diagonally in front of the original or grand position, coming to action several times on the retreating French.
So, lying on the ground by the cannonball-riddled building of La Belle Alliance, the surviving men of Rogers' company were finally able to fall into an exhausted sleep. They had played a key role as part of the Allied defensive line and were later singled out for praise by two high-ranking commanders. First, Sir James Kempt, whose infantry brigade had been drawn up behind the hedge at Waterloo, where Rogers' guns were first positioned. He wrote,
"The British Brigade of Artillery commanded by Major Rogers and the Hanoverian Brigade commanded by Major Heiser were most nobly served and judiciously placed, and these officers and men will be pleased to accept my particular thanks for their service."
And also Sir George Wood, commanding the British artillery, who wrote to Rogers,
"Your company at all times did you every justice, and proved it under your command at the Battle of Waterloo, in which your brigade bore a distinguished feature."
Once again, as with previous episodes looking at the Royal Artillery and Royal Horse Artillery, when we look at the casualty figures for Rogers' Battery, it's striking and baffling just how few there were. None of the officers were as much as wounded, and the casualties for the other ranks amount to just 16 in total, with just 4 men killed over the 3 days fighting. These 16 men are listed here. The 4 men killed were Bombardier James Charlton and Gunner William Rankin, who are both listed as being killed at Quatre on the 16th of June, probably from the fire of the French artillery there, while Gunners William Hartley and Charles Smith were killed at Waterloo. As discussed in previous episodes, I think it will always remain a mystery how few casualties there were among the British artillery, when we know they were in the thick of the fighting, the very most dangerous parts of the battlefield. We heard in our episode on the 33rd Foot of officers of that regiment being killed despite lying down on the reverse slope in a vain attempt to avoid the French cannonballs. And we heard in our episode on the 30th Foot of their beloved Captain Chambers being hit by a random musket ball and killed just as the fighting seemed over. There are so many instances such as these which prove what an extremely dangerous place the Allied Ridge was to be, and yet Rogers' battery lost just 2 men killed all day. And we know the battery was in the thick of the fighting, as evidenced by that 1 gun being spiked and then the loss of 2 further guns due to their horses being killed. It's an enigma. If anyone has any theories, do please add them in the comments. So what became of Rogers' battery in the years that followed? Well, Thomas Rogers later commanded the artillery in Gibraltar from 1828 to 1835, and many of the men would have accompanied him there. He rose to colonel and died at Woolwich in August 1839, aged 62. He's buried in the churchyard at nearby Old Charlton. Less than 2 months later, George Maule also died just a short distance away at the Crescent in Greenwich. The 2 officers seem to have become friends, or at least their Waterloo correspondence suggests so. George Maule seems to have been a keen cricketer. He features here in this match just 4 years after Waterloo, between a team representing the Prince's Plain Club, later to become Chislehurst Cricket Club, and a team representing the Royal Artillery. He doesn't seem to have had much luck with the bat, scoring a total of just 5 runs across 2 innings, but he had more luck as a bowler, taking 3 wickets. Speaking of good innings, the battery's most junior officer at Waterloo, 2nd Lieutenant Richard Wilson, was surely the last man standing of Rogers' Waterloo men. He had a long military career, rising to be a Major General, retiring to the island of Jersey, where he died at his residence, Floriana, at St. Brelard in 1876, aged 81. He's buried in St. Saviour's churchyard. We know very little of what became of most of Rogers' men. I will keep digging, but the Royal Artillery records tend to be extremely dry and devoid of exciting detail. Compared to the infantry and cavalry records, it's like excavating Pompeii and discovering only a vast number of accounting ledgers containing nothing but numbers and dates. That said, there are a few details to share. We know what became of 70% of the men. 12 were discharged within 2 years of Waterloo. These included some due to wounds received in the battle. Gunner James Gregson, for example, from Liverpool, was discharged due to the wound to his arm, while gunner Samuel Clinch from Kelvedon, Essex, lost a leg. Amputees were eligible for a special annuity, and he received his £6 a year until his death in 1846. As we've mentioned in previous episodes, the artillery tended to hang on to its men, and there were many Waterloo men in this battery who had very long careers. None, though, were longer than drummer James Galloway, who we mentioned earlier as being just 16 in 1815. He put down the drumsticks in 1817, becoming a gunner, and began a steady rise, being promoted to bombardier in 1828 and then sergeant in 1835. From 1829 to 1834 he served on Gibraltar, presumably still under Major Rogers. He was eventually discharged in 1843, aged 44, after an extraordinary 35 years' service. His conduct listed as exemplary. So that brings us to the end of this episode on Rogers Battery. I hope you found it interesting. Please click like and subscribe if so. My usual sincere thanks to the kind volunteers who read the extracts for this episode. Rogers Battery lives on in the present day Royal Artillery as 30 Battery, Rogers Company, and it was particularly great this week to have the words of Thomas Rogers read by James Billingham of that unit. Many thanks to James for that and for all his other excellent help with this podcast. Special thanks also to Mike Robinson for helping me identify where Rogers' guns were located on the 16th of June, and also for allowing me to use the map from his excellent book on Quatre. Next time we'll start on Pax Brigade, beginning with the 1st Foot, the Royal Scots, so I hope you'll join me for that. Until then, many thanks for watching.